everyone, and welcome to Curious Collections from the Benson Memorial Library, where we take you into the stacks to explore all the interesting, unusual, and curious finds available here at your local library. This month we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which guaranteed women's rights to vote. So today we're going to take a look at how the suffrage movement manifested itself right here in Titusville. Prior to the 19th Amendment being voted on in 1919, there were individual states that allowed women to vote. Wyoming was the first in 1869, and several others followed suit after that. By 1912, there were 10 states that allowed women voters, and this did not pass yet totally unnoticed by the women of Pennsylvania, who were not of that number. The women of Titusville were absolutely invested in mobilizing around causes. In the early 1890s, the Titusville Women's Club was founded. Besides hosting lectures, musical events, the club focused on a number of local and national issues, including such diverse activities as contributing to Clara Barton and the Red Cross, furnishing a new women's ward in the new Titusville Hospital, and discussing the possibility of harnessing Niagara Falls water power, as well as preparations for the World's Fair. By the early 1900s, the Women's Club was well established. They built a headquarters right next door to the library on the corner of Franklin and Walnut Streets, and their sights were set on bringing women's rights to the attention of the public. The club had their own dramatic society, which put on entertainments, and in 1911 they had a particularly interesting offering. The group secured rights to perform a one-act comedy by Cecily Hamilton entitled How the Vote Was Won. Royalties from producing the show were sent to support the suffrage movement in England. How the Vote Was Won was actually reviewed by one of the writers in the Titusville Herald, and they said this: "The leading man in the play, who has always been violently opposed to equal suffrage, finds thrust upon him 6 women of varying degrees of amiability and removes some distance in actual relationship. They make life unbearable for him. In the end, he sees the Prime Minister, and by a shrewd political combination, he secures the vote for women as a means of saving himself from domestic torment." In November of 1912, the Women's Club invited nationally known speaker Mrs. Beatrice Forbes Robertson Hale to town to give a lecture on the women's suffrage movement. Miss Forbes Robertson was an accomplished actress and suffrage speaker in England prior to moving to New York in 1907 to continue her career. She gave up the stage after marrying lawyer Swinburne Hale in 1910, but continued to lecture on women's rights for a number of years. Mrs. Hale spoke to a packed house in the Women's Club auditorium. She took on several of the challenges to the suffrage movement that evening, including the idea that the inclusion of women would increase the illiterate vote, to which she pointed out that twice as many girls as boys were finishing high school at that time, as well as the false assumption that women in politics was merely a fad of ladies who were wealthy and bored. Prior to her engagement at the Women's Club, Mrs. Hale also made a surprise visit to the Presbyterian Men's Club. She spoke for only 20 minutes, but left such an impression that the group gave her 3 cheers as she departed, even after her admonishment to them that if they believed politics to be a dirty game, it was their job to make the effort to clean it up. The Herald noted the next day that anyone who had not been in attendance the previous evening had missed one of the finest addresses ever delivered in Titusville. Women's suffrage was making its way into many aspects of society by this point. A 1913 advertisement for the Orpheum Movie Theater here in town touted a showing of His Honor the Mayor, a one-reel silent film about a gentleman who runs for mayor on a very anti-suffrage platform, and then finds his life turned upside down when his maiden aunt moves in and is running a suffrage campaign right out of his house and under his nose. In October of 1914, the Titusville Equal Franchise Association was established. Their first meeting was held in the high school auditorium, but by the next year the group had swelled to over 100 members, led by President Bessie Benson Emerson, the daughter of Byron and Minerva Benson, for whom the library is named. Mrs. Emerson wasn't actually able to attend the opening meeting, so it was chaired by Mrs. Alice Carter, wife of Colonel John Carter, both of whom we'll talk about in just a moment. Chairpersons for various committees were announced at the meeting, including the head of propaganda, Mrs. Helen Merrick Semple. Mrs. Semple also served as president of the State Federation of Pennsylvania Women. She was also a member of the State Board of Labor and Industry and influenced enactment of the child labor law. In July of 1915, the Titusville Equal Franchise Association opened a dedicated headquarters on West Central Avenue in town, and they also played host to the Women's Liberty Bell. The Women's Liberty Bell, or the Justice Bell, was a bronze replica of the original Liberty Bell, commissioned by a member of the Pennsylvania Women's Suffrage Association to draw attention to the suffrage movement in the days leading up to the state referendum on women voting in 1915. Unlike the Liberty Bell, the clapper of the Justice Bell was kept chained, symbolizing the silence of women denied the right to vote. The bell was mounted on a truck and toured through all counties of Pennsylvania that year, finally ending up at Independence Square in Philadelphia in time for the election. On July 24, Alice Carter, treasurer of the Equal Franchise Association, escorted the bell on its leg of the journey from Rouseville to Titusville. A rally was held at City Hall to welcome it, and according to the Herald, asked the help of the men of Crawford County to unfasten the chains which hold the tongue of the bell silent. The men's help is needed because the chains are not to be removed from the bell until the women of Pennsylvania are granted the right to vote. John Carter welcomed the bell and said, "At the birth of this great nation, Thomas Jefferson presented to the world that great charter which has been the beacon of light for human liberty in this and other lands throughout the world. In that great instrument, it is declared that all men are created free and equal. The signers of that great charter did not exclude their mothers, sisters, and wives from the inalienable rights of their fathers, brothers, and husbands, because the man alone was mentioned." Now, not every husband in town was quite as supportive of the movement as Colonel Carter. Axtell Biles, a prominent local lawyer and later president of the Tidewater Oil Company, had this to say to a group of women voters after the amendment had been ratified in 1920. "While I have never been an ardent supporter of the women's suffrage cause, I have never opposed the movement. I have doubted whether the enfranchisement of women might not be detrimental to them in the long run, and what is detrimental to the women would be an injury to the nation. I have wondered what would be the result of this unloosening of this tremendous emotional vote in the country." Later on in that speech, he also said that women would be sure to be keenly disappointed in many things, for politics is the nearest thing to war of anything I know of. The vote was taken up in Pennsylvania at the end of 1915. It did not pass the state, but Crawford County men had turned out largely in favor of it. Finally, in 1919, the 19th Amendment officially passed in Congress, and PA was the 8th state to ratify it on June 24th of that year. The Women's Club and the Equal Franchise Association didn't stop their work there, however. They hosted informational meetings about registration and taxes. The first day that registration opened for women voters, more than 1,010 women turned out in the area. Now, if you're interested in learning more about the suffrage movement, both here in Titusville and around the country, we have a number of books in the collection on the topic. You can check out our catalog at our website, benson.ccfls.org. You can also check out nwpastories.com, a blog run by our executive director, Jess Hilburn, which has detailed stories not only about Titusville suffragettes, but several other items of local historical interest. And as always, please come in. The librarians are happy to help you locate whatever you need. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you in the stacks.